Today I want to talk to you about idealism. It's the philosophical view that everything is mind-dependent. Everything in the world, including all the things we ordinarily think of as outside of us, are really constructions or projections of the mind. They all depend on the mind, so there's a sense in which everything is mental. Bishop George Berkeley, the person who, in a sense, invented idealism in the Western tradition, even though, parenthetically now, it goes all the way back to ancient times in the Hindu and Buddhist traditions. But in Western philosophy, it's a relatively new thing. Berkeley defined it this way: all the choir of heaven and furniture of the earth, in a word, all those bodies which compose the mighty frame of the world, have not any subsistence without a mind. Berkeley argues that everything is an idea. Tables, chairs, people, cats. Everything that ordinarily surrounds us and we think of as truly outside of us, in fact, in his view, have no independent existence. They all depend on the mind. They are nothing but ideas, as he puts it. Now, at first glance, you might think this is a bizarre view, but it's becoming increasingly dominant in Western philosophy. Ever since Berkeley, idealism has been one of the main views. Now, it's not by any means universal. There are still many realists, people who think that at least something is mind independent, that at least something is truly out there in the world. But the idealist says that that's not true, that everything is really a construction of or a projection of the mind. Here's how certain other idealists have put the point. The German idealist Johann Gottlieb Fichte puts it this way: for idealism, the intellect is acting, and absolutely nothing else. One should not even call it something active, because by this expression one points to something substantial, which is the subject of this activity. Arthur Schopenhauer, another German idealist, says this: no truth is more certain, no truth is more independent of all others, and no truth is less in need of proof than this one, that everything there is for cognition, that is, the whole world, is only an object in relation to a subject, the intuition of a beholder. So the entire world is nothing but an intuition, something that has a relation to a subject. In short, that is in some way dependent on a mind. He says the object as such always presupposes the subject as its necessary correlate. So the subject, that is a mind, a person, always remains outside the jurisdiction of the principle of sufficient reason. Thomas Hill Green, a British idealist, says this: the terms real and objective have no meaning except for a consciousness which presents its experiences to itself as determined by relations, and at the same time conceives a single and unalterable order of relations determining them, with which its temporary presentation as each experience occurs of the relations determining it may be contrasted. So Green is saying, basically, that real and objective simply mean related to a mind in the right kind of way. Sometimes the mind just constructs things and is aware of them as constructions when we engage in acts of imagination, for example. We don't call those things real or objective because we recognize that our minds are freely acting. But there are ways in which the mind constructs things or projects things that we're not aware of consciously, that we tend to think of as being outside of us. Those things are nevertheless the constructions and projections of a mind, he says. But being unaware of that, we tend to call them objective, we tend to call them real. But they're really not. In fact, they are simply relations to a mind. Another British idealist, John McTaggart, says that the progress of an idealistic philosophy may, from some points of view, be divided into three stages. The problem of the first is to prove that reality is not exclusively matter. The problem of the second is to prove that reality is exclusively spirit, that is to say, mind. The problem of the third is to determine what is the fundamental nature of spirit, or mind. What is the nature of a mind that allows it to produce what we call reality? Ontologically, he says, I'm an idealist. I believe that all that exists is spiritual. Everything that exists, in other words, is fundamentally mental, fundamentally spiritual. It is dependent on the mind. Josiah Royce was a prominent American idealist writing influentially around 100 years ago. Royce says this: either there is no error, or else judgments are true and false only in reference to a higher, inclusive thought, which they presuppose and which must in the last analysis be assumed as infinite and all-inclusive. Everything is really part of this one infinite thought. To be real, he says, now means primarily to be valid, to be true, to be in essence the standard for ideas. It's simply one more idea that serves as the standard for ideas. So if this is right, if the idealist says, in the end, everything is mind-dependent, everything is an idea, everything is spiritual, everything is in some sense mental, well, we have two questions. First of all, what exactly then is reality? What do you mean? We ordinarily distinguish what is inside us from what is outside of us. I can recognize ideas and distinguish them from what they are ideas of, perceptions from what they are perceptions of. And so, what sense does it make to deny that? And what are we doing when we draw that distinction? That's the third task that McTaggart points to. But there's something else. Why would somebody hold this sort of view? Berkeley tells us in his treatise, if we look but ever so little into our thoughts, we'll find it impossible to conceive a likeness except only between our ideas. Again, I ask whether those supposed originals are external things, of which our ideas are the pictures of representations, be themselves perceivable or no. If they are perceivable, then they're ideas and we've gained our point. But if you say they're not, I appeal to anyone, whether it be sense, to assert a color is like something which is invisible, hard or soft like something which is intangible, and so on with the rest. Now, Berkeley is saying, in effect, that everything before the mind, whether perceived or thought of, conceived of, is an idea. Locke had said as much, so he's really just following Locke here. But wait a minute, then if everything I perceive is an idea, and I never therefore perceive an object as such, well, how do I know if there is such a thing as an object behind that realm of ideas or perceptions? And so he ends up saying, really, then I'm just trapped in my own mind. There's no way to make sense of the idea of the existence of a truly external object, or any idea of the relationship between such an external object and my ideas of them. I've been drawing some diagrams showing a basic Platonic picture, but we can really draw a picture that indicates what the Platonist and the Aristotelian, two realists but of somewhat different kinds, indicates about all of this. So, let's imagine this is a mind, and this mind as perceiving an external object, something like a triangle, and having a perception or a thought about the triangle. Now, this is supposed to be an actual object, and the relationship here is a causal relationship. I perceive the triangle because there actually is a triangle outside me. It is a relationship of perception. And I recognize that object as a triangle. Now, how is it possible for me to do that? I must have the concept of a triangle. And according to the Aristotelian tradition, I derive that concept by abstraction from these experiences. So the arrow would go in this direction. If I'm a Platonist, I might think I have the concept by virtue of contact with a form, and so deny that abstraction account. But whatever is the case, I have a form, or maybe there's simply a property corresponding to my concept, the property of triangularity, and that property is something that actually does have now a logical relation. A logical relation we refer to as participation or instantiation, exemplification, or simply a matter of this having that property. This object, the triangle, the concrete triangle, has the property of triangularity. I'll draw it in a sort of boldface to indicate that this is something like the property or the form. So far, so good. That's a fundamentally realist picture. This triangle is mind independent. My thought of it, of course, is mind dependent. That's something taking place within a mind. It's mental. Having this concept is mental. On the other hand, the property itself doesn't seem to be a mental thing. It seems to be either a constituent of the world, if we're a realist about properties, about universals, or if we're nominalists, we think of this as something like a fiction that we construct on the basis of our concepts. So again, this arrow might go in either direction. We might think of the property as giving rise to our concept, as the Platonist does, or even the Aristotelian does, really. Or we might think of us as constituting the property by virtue of our concepts, something like the nominalist or maybe the conceptualist position. How does this picture get disrupted? Well, it has to do with the distinction that Descartes and Locke draw between primary and secondary qualities. They say there are certain features of the triangle that are really in the triangle. Those are the primary qualities of the object. But as perceived, this has other qualities that are not really there in the object. Secondary qualities, things like colors, textures, tastes, smells, sounds, these are things that are happening in my mind. The object itself may be emitting light at certain wavelengths. It may be producing sound waves of a certain kind, a certain frequency. My mind is in some way operating on those. My perceptual and cognitive faculties produce for me sensations of a leaf as green, for example, or a tree branch as brown, or a triangle as black or white or red or what have you. And so when all of that is happening, my mind is adding certain things. There are features of my perception, of my idea, that are not really there in the object, except as powers to cause those reactions in me. Well, if we want to draw that distinction here, we could say this is the thing in itself, as Kant says, this is the noumenon, this is the actual object or the substance, to put it in Aristotelian terminology. But somehow there's something else that is actually, well, produced by my mind. My perception has as a kind of content, well, yes, maybe a content, a conceptual content, like that's a triangle, but maybe also a perceptual content, the triangle, and here it has certain secondary qualities. So this is something that is in possession of primary qualities. The secondary qualities appear here only as powers. This does not literally have a color, in other words, but it does reflect things of certain wavelengths, and so it has the power of producing perceptions that have a color. To indicate the color, I will draw this in. And so this has some secondary qualities too. If this is the thing as represented, it has those primary qualities, but also the secondary qualities. Well, notice what's happening here. What's before the mind is this appearance, this phenomenon, as Kant puts it, this object of experience, as experienced, including the secondary qualities. What is its relation to this object with the primary qualities? Ooh, now we get a tricky problem, because it looks as if what's before the mind is this thing. This is what we hypothesize as being there in the world, Descartes and Locke. Notice, rationalist in the Platonic tradition, and empiricist in the Aristotelian tradition, nevertheless agree about this distinction. So what's the move that Berkeley and other idealists make? They examine this and they say, well, I see that this is there before the mind, but now I don't see why we hypothesize that there's an object like this at all. If everything before the mind is an appearance that includes both primary and secondary qualities, and if we can't get outside the mind to compare that to some object that is truly external to us, all we have access to are these mental constructions, these mental perceptions, the phenomena, the appearances, the objects as experienced by us. How can we evaluate their relation to the things as they truly are? Why do we think there are such things as objects truly external to us, truly independent of a mind, that are causally related to this? We have no reason to believe that at all. And so the idealist says several things. First of all, we talk about primary qualities here, but how do we know how to distinguish secondary qualities from primary qualities? We said this thing is truly a substance or a thing in itself. But if that's something that goes beyond the qualities we perceive to something that is underlying them out there in the world independently of us, what content could that possibly have? And so we claim this resembles this in certain respects, but not in others. How could we evaluate that idea of resemblance, or any account we might give of the relationship between the appearance and the thing in itself? You might see now what the idealist does. Says, I don't see why we accept this sort of account at all. In fact, we might take the object here and this supposed relation it has and just say, I have no reason to assume that any of that is there. But if it's not there, well then, I can't talk about a world that is actually independent of my mind. Everything I'm left with is a mental construction, a mental projection. It is something that is spiritual, something that is mental, something that is dependent on a mind. If that's right, then hey, I am left with a world that is entirely mental, that purely has an existence in relation to a perceiving and knowing subject. Everything, as Berkeley puts it, turns out to be an idea. Well, this may be right, or it may be wrong. Admittedly, the idealist says, maybe there are things out there in the world independently of me. Maybe they're truly mind-independent objects that are having a causal relation on me that cause me to have these experiences. But there is nothing that would let me know anything about them or give me any reason to believe they're even there. So the idealist says, to the extent that realism is a possibility, and admittedly I can't rule it out as a logical possibility, I have no reason to accept it. So the idealist sometimes will say quite boldly, there is no such thing. Sometimes retreat to a position of saying, well, this is all I have evidence for. Maybe there's such a thing, but I have no reason to believe it. That's a wild hypothesis that there's something truly out there behind this. We might imagine primitive peoples, for example, holding that within each object in the world is some kind of spirit, some kind of little god or goddess that makes it do what it does. Well, similarly, the realist says, ooh, behind each appearance there is this thing in the world that we have no access to and can't perceive, but is making it do what it does. The idealist says, it's nothing but a superstition. We have no reason to accept it.